A maid approached a prince and told him not to travel with his wife. The next morning, a royal carriage was parked in front of her humble home. Lucy Martinez woke with a gasp, her nightgown damp with sweat. Despite the autumn chill that seeped through the servants' quarters, the dream, the vision, was already fading like morning mist, leaving behind only fragments, a glint of steel in darkness, crimson spreading across an embroidered royal crest, and screams that echoed across stone walls. "Not again," she whispered, pressing her palms against her eyes as if to push the images back into her mind, before they vanished completely. Outside her small window, the first light of dawn illuminated the magnificent spires of Liberty's royal palace, its white stones catching the golden rays in stark contrast to the humble dwellings clustered at its feet. Lucy drew a deep breath and swung her legs over the edge of her narrow bed. Dreams were luxuries servants couldn't afford, especially not on days when the royal household was in such upheaval. At 20, Lucy had spent nearly half her life in service to the palace, scrubbing floors and changing linens while keeping her head down and her extraordinary gift hidden. The same gift that had her grandmother shunned as a witch in their village years ago, the gift that now showed her fragments of a future she couldn't fully understand. "Just nerves," she muttered to herself, splashing cold water on her face from the basin. Everyone's on edge with the royal delegation preparing to leave. But as she dressed in her simple gray uniform, her hands trembled. This vision had been different, more urgent, more vivid, and it wasn't the first concerning the prince's upcoming diplomatic journey. Liberty in 1785 was a kingdom balanced on a knife's edge. Tensions with neighboring Pinecrest had escalated over the past year, with border skirmishes threatening to erupt into full-scale war. The prince's marriage to Princess Marianne of Pinecrest was supposed to have eased those tensions, but Lucy had overheard enough whispered conversations among the nobles to know that many suspected the peace was merely an illusion. "You look like you've seen a ghost," said Agnes, another maid, as Lucy entered the kitchen where servants gathered for their morning meal. "Just didn't sleep well," Lucy replied, reaching for a piece of bread. "The Queen Mother had her astrologer in again last night," Agnes whispered, leaning closer. "Third time this week. They say she's worried about the prince's journey." Lucy kept her expression neutral despite the jolt this sent through her. Queen Mother Elizabeth Thompson, the king's second wife and Prince Frank's stepmother, was known to consult mystics and fortune-tellers, a fact that made Lucy keep her own abilities even more tightly guarded. "When do they leave?" Lucy asked, though she already knew. "Tomorrow at first light," Agnes replied. "The prince, Princess Marianne, and half the court, it seems. Quite the procession for a simple border negotiation." Lucy nodded absently, fragments of her vision flashing before her eyes again. She needed to sort through the laundry in the East Wing, which would give her time to think, to plan, as she climbed the servants' staircase with her basket. Memories from another life rose unbidden, a life before the palace, before she became invisible in a gray uniform, streets of Oak Ridge, where a boy with laughing eyes had once been her closest friend, Frank Valenti, the blacksmith's supposed son, whose quick wit and kind heart had made the hardships of their poor district more bearable. Then came the day when royal guards appeared, when the king recognized his bastard son after his queen died, when Frank was whisked away to a life of privilege. Lucy remembered watching from the shadows as her friend was transformed into a prince before her eyes, his humble clothes exchanged for fine garments, his calloused hands suddenly too precious for labor. Years later, after the fire that claimed her parents and left only her grandmother to raise her, Lucy had managed to secure a position at the palace through persistence and her grandmother's herbal remedies that had once healed a cook's festering wound. But by then, Prince Frank no longer saw the faces of servants, and certainly wouldn't have recognized the girl who had grown into a young woman bearing little resemblance to his childhood playmate. The East Wing was quiet as Lucy went about her work, mechanically folding sheets and listening to the hushed conversations of passing courtiers. Talk of the journey dominated everything: the route they would take through the contested mountain pass, the reception awaiting them at Pinecrest's summer palace, the strategic importance of the negotiations. By midday, her vision had become a leaden certainty in her stomach. Death awaited the prince on this journey, not an accident, but a carefully orchestrated trap. A trap she could see pieces of, but not enough to understand who had set it, or precisely where it would spring. Lucy found herself wandering toward the royal gardens, a risk for a servant with no business there. But she knew the prince often walked there alone before afternoon council meetings. Her grandmother would call this foolishness. Revealing her gift had brought nothing but suffering to their family through generations. But watching Frank die in her visions without trying to warn him wasn't something she could live with. Regardless of the consequences, the garden was a masterpiece of careful cultivation. With hedge mazes and marble fountains where noble ladies strolled with parasols, Lucy kept to the shadows of the tall yew hedges, her gray dress helping her blend with the stonework as she watched for the prince. She didn't have to wait long. Frank Valenti appeared along the gravel path, his royal blue coat adorned with silver embroidery that caught the sunlight. At 30, he had grown into his royal role with a confident bearing that concealed any trace of his humble origins, yet something in his profile, the way he paused to examine a late-blooming rose, reminded Lucy so sharply of the boy from Oakridge that her chest ached. For a moment, she hesitated. What she planned was more than dangerous. It was nearly suicidal for someone of her station to approach royalty uninvited, but the vision flashed again in her mind. Blood, darkness, screams, the royal crest torn and stained. "Your Highness," Lucy said softly, stepping out from behind a hedge when he passed near enough that no one else would hear. "Please forgive my intrusion." The prince turned, his expression moving from surprise to annoyance. "What is the meaning of this?" Lucy dropped into a deep curtsy, keeping her eyes lowered. "I beg your pardon, my lord. I would not dare approach if the matter were not of life and death. Speak quickly." "Then," he said, glancing around to ensure they weren't observed, "though you should know that servants do not address me directly. My lord, I implore you," Lucy's voice trembled despite her determination, "do not travel with the princess tomorrow. I have seen blood and tragedy in my dreams." The prince's face hardened. "You dare to approach me with superstition and fortune-telling." "Not superstition, your highness. The dreams I have, they come true." Lucy looked up finally, meeting his eyes directly in a breach of protocol that could cost her dearly. Something flickered in Frank's expression, a momentary confusion, as though a distant memory tried to surface. He studied her face with unusual intensity. "There is something familiar about you," he said, his voice lower. "Have we—" "Frank, there you are." The princess's voice cut through the garden air like a blade. Marianne of Pinecrest appeared around the hedge, her elaborate gown rustling with each step. Beautiful and poised, she embodied royal elegance in ways Lucy could never hope to understand. The prince's expression closed immediately. Whatever moment of recognition had passed between them vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "This servant was just leaving," he said coldly, his gaze hardening. "In fact, she won't be returning at all. See that she's dismissed from the palace immediately for her impertinence." Lucy felt the blood drain from her face. "Please, your highness." "Enough," Frank snapped, his voice carrying the full weight of royal command. "Guards," as 2 royal guards appeared to escort her away. Lucy caught one last glimpse of the prince's face. Behind the mask of royal indignation, something troubled lingered in his eyes, a shadow of doubt or recognition that gave her the smallest hope that her warning, however disastrous for her personally, might have planted a seed of caution. But as she was marched from the palace grounds with nothing but the clothes on her back, Lucy Martinez knew her vision was still unfolding exactly as she'd feared. The pieces were in motion, and somehow, against all odds, she would have to find another way to change a future that seemed increasingly inevitable. Evening shadows stretched across the rutted dirt path as Lucy trudged toward the small cottage she shared with her grandmother at the edge of the village. Her dismissal from the palace left her numb, her mind racing with fragments of her vision still haunting her thoughts. The cottage came into view, humble but well kept, with dried herbs hanging from the eaves and smoke curling from the chimney. Her grandmother, Ilara, would be preparing a simple supper. Unaware that her granddaughter's life had just been upended. "What am I going to tell her?" Lucy whispered to herself. The position at the palace had been their lifeline, providing steady income and relative security, rare commodities for women living alone, especially ones with their reputation. Before Lucy could reach the door, a flicker of movement in the growing darkness caught her eye. She froze, heart pounding, as a cloaked figure emerged from the shadows beside their garden. Years of caution made her reach for the small knife hidden in her pocket. "Your vigilance serves you well, Lucy Martinez," said a voice that sent ice through her veins. A voice accustomed to command, to being obeyed without question. The figure pushed back her hood, revealing the unmistakable profile of Queen Mother Elizabeth Thompson. Lucy dropped immediately into a deep curtsy, eyes fixed on the ground. "Your Majesty, I don't understand." "Stand up, girl. I have no patience for formalities when there are no witnesses." The Queen Mother's tone was brisk, almost irritated. "Your grandmother is inside, preparing tea for us as we speak. She was not surprised to see me." Lucy straightened slowly, her mind reeling. "My grandmother expected you." A thin smile crossed Elizabeth's face. "We've known each other longer than you might imagine. Come, the night grows cold." Inside the cottage, Lucy found her grandmother calmly setting out their best chipped teacups on a worn wooden table. Alara's weathered face betrayed no shock at entertaining royalty in their humble home. The Queen Mother settled onto their only cushioned chair with practiced ease, as though she regularly took tea in peasants' cottages. "Your granddaughter has had another vision," Elizabeth said, accepting a steaming cup from Alara. Not a question, but a statement. Lucy stared at her grandmother, betrayal washing over her. "You told her about my gift, after warning me my entire life to keep it hidden." Alara's gaze remained steady. "There are things you don't understand yet, child. Secrets that go beyond our little cottage. The palace has eyes and ears everywhere," the Queen Mother added, studying Lucy with unsettling intensity. "I've known about your abilities since you first joined the household staff. Did you truly believe your appointment was mere coincidence?" The revelation staggered Lucy. All these years of careful secrecy, believing she had protected herself, when in reality, "You've been watching me," she whispered. "Monitoring," Elizabeth corrected. "Just as I monitor all those with unusual gifts who might be of use to the crown, or pose a threat to it." Alara placed a gentle hand on Lucy's arm. "Tell us what you saw, child." Lucy hesitated, looking between the two older women. Whatever game they were playing, she was clearly a pawn, but the urgency of her vision outweighed her resentment. Blood, an ambush, the royal crest torn and stained. Lucy closed her eyes, forcing herself to recall the fragments. "It happens during the prince's journey to Pinecrest. I tried to warn him, but he had you dismissed." The Queen Mother nodded. "Predictable. Frank has spent years burying his common origins beneath courtly arrogance. You knew I would approach him. I suspected you might try something foolish when your visions became more frequent." Elizabeth sipped her tea with remarkable composure. "What you couldn't know is that Frank's journey is essential, and the danger may be even greater than what you've glimpsed." Lucy looked to her grandmother, who nodded solemnly. "The Queen Mother is here because she needs your help, child." "My help?" Lucy laughed bitterly. "I've just been thrown out of the palace. What could I possibly do now?" Elizabeth set down her cup with a decisive click. "You can enter the palace again, not as a servant, but as something far more valuable." From beneath her cloak, she withdrew a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl. Opening it revealed a delicate silver necklace bearing the crest of a noble house Lucy didn't recognize. This belonged to Lady Catherine Blackwood, a distant cousin of mine from the northern provinces, Elizabeth explained. "Few at court have met her, but her correspondence has established her existence. She recently expressed interest in joining the diplomatic journey to Pinecrest." Understanding dawned on Lucy. "You want me to pose as a noblewoman?" "As Lady Catherine's lady's maid," Elizabeth corrected. "Still a servant, but one who travels with the diplomatic party, and has access to spaces and conversations a palace maid never would." "That's impossible," Lucy protested. "I know nothing of such positions. I'd be discovered immediately." "You underestimate yourself," the Queen Mother replied. "You've been observing the nobility for years. Besides, your grandmother has been preparing you for more than you realize." Lucy turned to Alara, questions multiplying. What does she mean? Her grandmother's eyes held a sadness Lucy had never fully understood. "The way you speak, how you hold yourself. I didn't teach you those things so you could be a better maid, child." "Your accent slips when you're tired," Elizabeth observed. "The educated speech pattern emerges. Your natural pattern, I suspect." Lucy felt the ground shifting beneath her. "I don't understand." "You will," Alara promised. But first, we must focus on the immediate danger. The Queen Mother rose, suddenly all business. The diplomatic party leaves at dawn. You have until then to prepare. Your mission is simple: protect my stepson and identify the traitors in our court. And why would I agree to this? Lucy challenged, finding her courage. After what happened today? Because you care what happens to Frank Valenti. Elizabeth cut in, her gaze piercing. I've seen how you watch him when you think no one notices. There's history there, a connection you haven't shared even with your grandmother. Lucy's cheeks burned. That's not... And, the Queen Mother continued relentlessly, because you have the gift of foresight but lack the context to understand what you see. I can provide that context. What context? The vision you described. It's only part of a larger conspiracy, one that threatens not just Frank but the entire kingdom. Elizabeth moved toward the door, then paused. There's something else you should know. The fire that killed your parents wasn't an accident. The words hit Lucy like a physical blow. What? Help me protect the prince and uncover the traitors in our midst, and I promise you'll learn the truth about your family. The Queen Mother pulled her hood up, her expression hidden in shadow. Your grandmother has everything you'll need. I'll have a carriage sent before dawn. After Elizabeth left, Lucy rounded on her grandmother. How long have you been in league with the Queen Mother? What haven't you told me about my parents, about myself? Alara sighed deeply, suddenly looking every one of her 70 years. There's no time for the full story now, child. But know this. Your visions are showing you pieces of a puzzle that began long before you were born. A puzzle where your place is far more significant than you've been led to believe. She crossed to a loose floorboard near the hearth and pried it up, revealing a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. These clothes will help you look the part. And this, she pulled out a small worn book with faded leather binding, contains names and details about the noble houses. Study it tonight. This is madness, Lucy whispered, even as she accepted the items. I can't possibly pull this off. You can and you will, Alara said firmly, because if your vision comes to pass, it means more than just the prince's life is at stake. It means they've found what they've been searching for all these years. Who are they? What have they been searching for? Her grandmother's gaze turned distant, as though seeing beyond the cottage walls to some darker horizon. The answers will come, but not from me. Not tonight. Some truths are too dangerous until you're in a position to act on them. Dawn was still hours away, but as Lucy clutched the unfamiliar fine clothes and mysterious book, she felt as though she stood on the edge of a precipice. Behind her lay the simple, if difficult, life she had known. Before her waited something vastly more complex and dangerous, a web of intrigue she barely understood, and somewhere in that web waited answers about who she truly was, and why her visions might hold the key to liberty's future. The royal procession stretched like a glittering serpent along the eastern road, banners snapping in the morning breeze. Lucy sat rigidly in a modest carriage near the rear, reserved for the ladies' maids and lesser attendants of the diplomatic party. Her borrowed dress, finer than anything she'd ever worn but simple enough for her station, felt stiff and foreign against her skin. First time traveling with the court? Asked the woman beside her, a sharp-eyed lady's maid named Georgina, who served one of the Duchess of Harrington's daughters. Lucy nodded, clutching the small valise in her lap. Lady Catherine was unexpected in her request for my service. Georgina replied, clearly hoping for more gossip. When Lucy offered nothing further, the woman turned her attention to the passing countryside. The Queen Mother's instructions had been precise. Observe everything, speak little, and avoid drawing attention. Lucy had spent the pre-dawn hours memorizing the details from her grandmother's book. Noble houses, their crests, recent scandals and alliances. The knowledge felt like ill-fitting clothes, necessary but uncomfortable. Near the front of the procession, visible only when the road curved, rode Prince Frank and Princess Marianne in an ornate royal carriage, flanked by mounted guards in Liberty's blue and silver uniforms. Lucy had glimpsed them briefly at the palace gates before dawn, Frank looking stern and distant, Marianne's delicate features arranged in practiced diplomatic pleasantness. Have you heard about the Duke of Montgomery? Georgina whispered suddenly, leaning closer. They say he's meeting us at the border. Lucy controlled her expression. The Duke. I thought he rarely left his estates. That's what makes it interesting, doesn't it? Georgina's eyes gleamed with the excitement of fresh gossip. He's the king's half-brother, never officially recognized, of course, and rumor has it he's never forgiven the royal family for denying him his rightful place. She made a theatrical gesture with her gloved hands. Lucy had read about Montgomery in her grandmother's book, a powerful nobleman with lands strategically positioned along the border with Pinecrest, known for his ruthless business dealings and private army of mercenaries that allegedly helped keep the peace in disputed territories. The book had mentioned nothing of his relation to the royal family. "Is the Duke close with the prince and princess?" Lucy asked, trying to sound merely curious. Georgina snorted delicately. "Montgomery avoids court like the plague, but they say he and Princess Marianne share a surprising rapport. Some whisper it's because she reminds him of his mother. She was from Pinecrest, too. You know?" The carriage hit a rut in the road, jostling them. Lucy used the moment to process this information. Could Montgomery be connected to the danger in her vision? She needed to get closer to the main party, to observe the key players directly. Her opportunity came when they stopped to rest the horses near midday. The royal party spread across a meadow, servants erecting temporary pavilions for the nobles to take refreshment. Lucy, carrying a basket of Lady Catherine's supposed belongings, moved purposefully toward the largest tent where the prince and princess would be seated. "You there?" called a sharp voice. "Sharp. Lady's maid. Come here." Lucy turned to find an older woman with iron-gray hair beckoning her. The woman's black dress marked her as a senior lady-in-waiting, likely to the princess herself. "Yes, my lady," Lucy cursed, careful to keep her eyes appropriately lowered. "Lady Catherine's new maid. Aren't you peculiar that she'd bring someone untested on such an important journey?" The woman's gaze was assessing, suspicious. "My lady is particular in her preferences," Lucy responded carefully. "Indeed," the woman sniffed. "Well, make yourself useful. The princess's gloves need pressing. Follow me," heart pounding with unexpected good fortune. Lucy followed the woman to a smaller tent where the princess's personal items were being arranged. Inside, several attendants moved efficiently, preparing Marianne's afternoon ensemble. "Wait here," the gray-haired woman instructed, leaving Lucy just inside the entrance. From this vantage point, Lucy could see through the partially open flap to where the prince stood in conversation with a tall, imposing man whose bearing screamed nobility. Despite his relatively simple attire, the man's hawkish profile and streaks of silver at his temples made something click in Lucy's mind. This must be the Duke of Montgomery himself. Arrived earlier than expected. "Absolutely unnecessary risk," Montgomery was saying, his voice pitched low but carrying on the breeze. "This route takes you directly through contested territory. The risk makes the statement all the more powerful," Frank replied. "My marriage to Marianne was meant to ease tensions, yet the border raids continue. Traveling openly shows both kingdoms our commitment to resolution, or it makes you an easier target," Montgomery countered, placing a familiar hand on the prince's shoulder that made Lucy frown. Such familiarity between them contradicted Georgina's gossip. Their conversation cut off as Princess Marianne approached. Her gold-embroidered riding dress catching the sunlight, Lucy was struck by her grace, and by the subtle change in her demeanor as she neared Montgomery. Something in the princess's eyes hardened, became more focused, while her smile remained diplomatically perfect. "Duke," Marianne greeted him with a curtsy that was precisely the correct depth for their relative stations. "What a pleasant surprise to find you joining our journey so early." "Princess?" Montgomery bowed deeply. "A fraction too deeply," Lucy noted. "I thought it prudent to ensure your safety personally as you pass through these troublesome regions." "How considerate," Marianne replied, her accent from Pinecrest slightly more pronounced than when she spoke in court. "Though I'm certain my husband has arranged adequate protection." The dynamic between the three was fascinating and concerning. Lucy sensed undercurrents she couldn't quite interpret, but the tension was palpable. "Your gloves, girl," snapped the gray-haired woman, returning to thrust a pair of delicate lace gloves at Lucy. "Press them carefully and return them directly to me, and be quick about it." Lucy cursed again and retreated with the gloves, her mind racing. She needed to get closer to the princess, to observe her interactions with Montgomery more carefully. If there was a conspiracy, understanding their relationship seemed crucial. As the journey resumed that afternoon, Lucy noticed subtle changes in the procession. Montgomery's men, distinguishable by their dark green livery, had integrated themselves among the royal guards. The Duke himself now rode near the royal carriage, ostensibly as additional protection, but effectively controlling who approached the prince and princess. Lucy watched from her own carriage, frustrated by the distance. A fragment of her vision flashed in her mind, blood on embroidery that she now recognized as matching the pattern on the prince's ceremonial jacket. "The mountains will be the most dangerous part," Georgina commented, mistaking Lucy's concern for general nervousness. "Bandits favor the passes, despite Montgomery's men supposedly keeping them clear." "How long until we reach the mountains?" Lucy asked. 2 days, perhaps 3 if the weather turns. Georgina leaned closer. "They say the old monastery near the highest pass is haunted by monks who were slaughtered during the last border war. We'll stop there for the night. No other shelter for miles." Lucy barely heard the ghost story, focused instead on the timeline. 2 or 3 days. Her visions rarely showed events more than a week ahead. If the danger awaited in the mountain passes, she had precious little time to untangle the conspiracy and prevent whatever attack was coming. As dusk approached, the procession halted beside a small lake. Tents rose quickly, transforming the wilderness into a temporary royal court. Lucy, finally freed from her carriage, used her duties as an excuse to move through the camp. Observing, the Duke of Montgomery had established his presence at the prince's right hand, offering counsel on their route and security arrangements. Princess Marianne maintained her perfect poise, but twice Lucy caught her exchanging glances with Montgomery when Frank's attention was elsewhere, glances that seemed laden with meaning. As night fell, Lucy retreated to the small tent she shared with 2 other ladies' maids. Lying awake on her pallet, she sorted through her observations, trying to discern patterns. Montgomery's unexpected appearance, his strange familiarity with both royals, the way he'd positioned his men throughout the procession. Something was taking shape, but the full picture remained frustratingly elusive. Just like her visions, fragments that hinted at disaster without revealing how to prevent it. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would find a way to get closer to Princess Marianne. If there was a conspiracy, the princess was either a target or complicit. Either way, understanding her role was crucial to unraveling the danger that Lucy could feel drawing closer with each mile they traveled toward the mountains. By the 3rd day, the procession had begun its ascent into the contested mountain territory that formed a natural barrier between Liberty and Pinecrest. Sheer cliffs rose on one side of the narrow road while steep drops fell away on the other, forcing the caravan into a vulnerable single-file line that made Lucy increasingly anxious. "Perfect place for an ambush," she murmured, gazing out the carriage window at the rugged landscape. "What was that?" Georgina asked, eyebrow raised. "Just admiring the view," Lucy replied quickly. That morning, she'd woken from another fragmented vision, this time seeing a narrow mountain path, an overturned carriage, and Montgomery standing over a fallen figure whose face remained shadowed. The sense of urgency had intensified, leaving Lucy with a bone-deep certainty that today was when her vision would unfold. A sharp crack split the air, followed by shouts from the front of the procession. Their carriage jerked to a halt. "Bandits!" Georgina whispered, clutching Lucy's arm. Lucy shook her head. "Stay here." Something about the precise timing of the disruption felt wrong. This wasn't a random attack. Ignoring Georgina's protests, Lucy slipped from the carriage. Chaos had erupted ahead. Guardsmen with drawn swords surrounding the royal carriage while others searched the rocky slopes above. The crack, Lucy realized, had been a warning shot, not an attack. Through the confusion, she spotted Montgomery conferring intensely with the captain of the guard, pointing toward a barely visible path that branched from the main road. "Safer route," she caught as she edged closer. "My men scouted it yesterday. It rejoins the main road 5 miles ahead, bypassing this exposed section." The captain looked skeptical. "Your Grace, protocol demands we keep to established routes. Protocol won't protect the prince if he's dead," Montgomery cut in sharply. "This is precisely the situation I feared. The warning shot came from that ridge. The next one might find its target." Lucy slipped behind a supply wagon, inching closer to where Prince Frank had emerged from the royal carriage, his face tight with concern. Princess Marianne remained inside, her pale face visible at the window. "What do you suggest, Montgomery?" Frank asked, his voice carrying the strain of command. "Divide the procession," the Duke replied promptly, as if he'd been waiting for this question. "Send the main caravan ahead on the primary road as a decoy. You, the princess, and a small guard will take the alternate path with me. We'll reunite at the monastery before nightfall." Lucy's heart raced. This was it. The moment when the future she'd glimpsed began to take solid form. The alternate route, the separated procession, it all aligned with fragments from her vision. "I don't like it," the captain protested. "The prince shouldn't travel with reduced protection." "Which is more dangerous?" Montgomery countered. "A known target on an exposed road, or a small, fast-moving group taking an unexpected route." Frank nodded decisively. "Montgomery's logic is sound. Prepare a small escort. We leave immediately." Lucy backed away, mind racing. She needed to be with that smaller group. But how? Her carriage would certainly continue with the main procession. A flash of inspiration struck. Lucy hurried toward the royal carriage where Princess Marianne was now stepping down, assisted by her gray-haired lady-in-waiting. "Madame," Lucy called, approaching the older woman with a deferential bow. "Lady Catherine asked me to inform you she's fallen ill with the mountain air. She wondered if her medicines might be useful to Her Highness. Should the alternate route prove difficult?" The lady-in-waiting frowned. "The princess has her own remedies." "Of course," Lucy nodded earnestly. Lady Catherine merely thought, given the unexpected change in plans, an extra attendant might be useful for Her Highness. "I've experience with mountain sickness." The woman studied Lucy suspiciously, but the chaotic preparations around them worked in Lucy's favor. "Fine," she snapped finally. "Gather your ladies' medicines and join us quickly. But stay out of the way unless called upon." Lucy hurried to complete her impromptu mission, retrieving a small satchel of harmless herbs from Lady Catherine's belongings. Within 20 minutes, she found herself riding in the last of 3 carriages that made up the smaller procession. The prince and princess in the first, Montgomery and the captain in the second, and Lucy with the lady-in-waiting and another servant in the third. The alternate path was rough, barely wide enough for the carriages and dangerously steep in places. As they climbed higher, Lucy felt increasingly uneasy. She closed her eyes, trying to force more details from her fragmented visions, but nothing new emerged. "Strange that the Duke knew of this path," the lady-in-waiting muttered, more to herself than to Lucy. "Has the Duke not traveled these mountains before?" Lucy ventured. The woman's lips thinned. "Montgomery hasn't left his estate in years before this journey. Most peculiar that he should appear now, with such convenient knowledge." This confirmed Lucy's suspicions. Montgomery's appearance was no coincidence, and this diversion was part of a careful plan. But to what end? If he meant harm to the prince, why not let the supposed bandits attack on the main road? Unless the bandits were never there at all. Just a manufactured threat to justify this deviation, the carriage suddenly lurched to a stop, nearly throwing Lucy from her seat. Shouts erupted outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of steel on steel. "Stay inside," the lady-in-waiting ordered, her face pale, but Lucy was already moving toward the door, cracking it open to peer outside. What she saw made her blood run cold. Men in green livery, Montgomery's men, had surrounded the first carriage, but rather than protecting it, they were engaging with the royal guards in combat. The prince stood outside his carriage, sword drawn, fighting alongside his few remaining loyal guards, while Montgomery himself watched from horseback, making no move to intervene. Princess Marianne remained in her carriage, eerily calm amidst the chaos. When her eyes met Montgomery's across the battlefield, Lucy caught a silent exchange that confirmed her worst fears. They were working together. This was the ambush from her vision, but not as anyone would have expected. Not bandits on the main road, but a carefully orchestrated betrayal on a secluded path known only to Montgomery. Lucy slipped from the carriage. Keeping low and using the rocky terrain for cover, she needed to reach the prince, to somehow help him against overwhelming odds. A royal guard fell just yards from her, a crossbow bolt protruding from his chest. Lucy seized his fallen sword, its weight unfamiliar but necessary. She had no combat training, but desperation drove her forward. Prince Frank fought with surprising skill, his court demeanor replaced by the street-fighting instincts of his youth in Oakridge. But he was being steadily pushed back toward a steep drop-off behind him, a tactical move that Lucy recognized with horror. They didn't plan to kill him outright. They wanted his death to appear accidental, a tragic fall during a bandit attack. "Your Highness!" Lucy shouted, closing the distance. "Behind you! The cliff!" Frank's head jerked toward her voice, recognition and confusion flashing across his face in the split second before he had to parry another attack. That moment of distraction was enough. His attacker pressed forward, forcing the prince to step dangerously close to the edge. Without thinking, Lucy hurled herself forward, swinging the unwieldy sword at the attacker's legs. Her blow lacked skill but succeeded in surprising the man, throwing him off balance. Frank seized the opportunity, dispatching his opponent with a practiced thrust. Their eyes met over the fallen man. "You," he said, breathing hard. "The maid from the garden." "No time," Lucy gasped, pointing to where Montgomery was now advancing, his own sword drawn. "This was planned, the Duke and Princess. They're working together." Frank's face hardened with disbelief. But when he glanced toward his wife's carriage and saw Marianne watching impassively as his guards were slaughtered, understanding dawned in his eyes. "We need to reach the main road," Lucy said urgently. "There are too many of them here." A path skirted the cliff edge, narrow and treacherous, but potentially their only escape route. Frank nodded, seeming to read her thoughts. "Stay close," he ordered, cutting down another attacker before turning toward the path. Lucy followed, her borrowed sword now serving more as a walking stick on the treacherous terrain. Behind them, Montgomery's shouts urged his men in pursuit as they rounded a bend in the path. Lucy's foot slipped on loose stones. She would have plummeted over the edge if Frank hadn't caught her arm, pulling her to safety with strength born of desperation. Their eyes met again, and something shifted in his expression, a deeper recognition beyond the maid who had warned him in the garden. But there was no time to dwell on it, as Montgomery and two of his men appeared around the bend. "This doesn't have to end with your death, Frank," Montgomery called, his voice almost regretful. "Surrender now, renounce your claim to the throne, and you can live out your days in comfortable exile. While you rule as Marianne's puppet," Frank spat back. "I think not, Uncle." Montgomery's smile was cold. "So you've known of our relation. It would have been simpler if you hadn't. Simpler to kill the king's acknowledged bastard than his unacknowledged brother." Frank's laugh was bitter. "The crown was never yours to claim. A matter of perspective," Montgomery replied, advancing slowly. "And soon, a matter of historical record rather than current affairs." Lucy tensed, preparing for the inevitable attack. But before Montgomery could strike, a distant horn sounded from the direction of the main road. The royal signal for assembly. The main procession had arrived at the rendezvous point earlier than expected. Montgomery hesitated, calculation clear in his eyes. "This isn't over," he said finally, stepping back. "But perhaps it's more prudent to let nature take its course for now." He gestured to the treacherous path ahead. The monastery is still miles away, and darkness falls quickly in these mountains. Such a tragedy when travelers lose their way. With a mocking salute, he retreated, taking his men with him. Lucy knew they wouldn't go far, just out of sight, waiting for night to fall, or for Frank and Lucy to make a fatal misstep on the narrow path. "We need to keep moving," she urged, watching the sky where heavy clouds were gathering. "A storm's coming, and we need to reach the monastery before dark." Frank studied her with intense curiosity. "Who are you really, and how did you know about this ambush?" "My name is Lucy Martinez," she replied simply, and explaining how I knew would take longer than we have. "Please, Your Highness, trust me just until we reach safety." After a moment's hesitation, Frank nodded. "Lead on, Lucy Martinez, but know that when we're safe, I'll have my answers." Together they continued along the perilous mountain path, the first drops of rain beginning to fall as thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain lashed against ancient stone walls as Lucy and Prince Frank finally stumbled through the heavy wooden doors of St. Ambrose Monastery. The journey had been brutal. 3 hours navigating treacherous mountain paths in steadily worsening weather, constantly alert for Montgomery's men who could have been tracking them. "Hello," Frank called out, his voice echoing through the cavernous entry hall. No response came. The monastery appeared deserted, though candles burned in iron sconces along the walls. "The monks maintain this as a refuge," Lucy explained, wringing water from her skirts. "They leave provisions but stay at their main abbey during storm seasons." Frank raised an eyebrow. You seem remarkably well informed about an obscure mountain monastery. My grandmother mentioned it, Lucy said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Alara had indeed told stories of mountain sanctuaries when Lucy was a child. They moved deeper into the monastery, following the flickering candlelight to a great hall with a massive stone fireplace. A fire had been laid but not lit, evidence that someone had expected travelers. Frank quickly set about kindling the flames while Lucy explored the adjacent kitchen, finding bread, cheese, and dried fruit left for wayfarers. The main procession will be concerned by our absence, Frank said, as they settled before the growing fire with their simple meal. But in this weather, they can't mount a search until morning, and Montgomery will claim you were lost in the ambush, Lucy added grimly. By now, Princess Marianne is likely playing the grieving widow. Frank's jaw tightened. I still cannot fathom Marianne's involvement. Our marriage was arranged, but I thought we had developed a mutual respect, if not affection. The alliance with Pinecrest was never genuine, Lucy said carefully. From what I observed, Montgomery and the princess have a connection that predates your marriage. Thunder crashed outside, and the wind howled through the monastery's stone corridors like restless spirits in the flickering firelight. With his royal attire sodden and disheveled, Frank looked less like the imperious prince who had dismissed her from the palace, and more like the boy she had once known in Oak Ridge. Now, he said, setting aside his plate, you owe me an explanation. How did you know about the ambush? And don't tell me it was merely suspicion of Montgomery. You knew specifics, the cliff, the timing. Lucy hesitated. Revealing her gift had rarely ended well, yet concealing it now seemed impossible. I see things, she said finally, fragments of what may come to pass, not always clearly and never completely, but enough to recognize danger when it approaches. Frank studied her with surprising intensity. A seer, like the Queen Mother's pet astrologers. Not like them, Lucy said sharply. My grandmother has the same ability. It's passed down through generations. We don't perform for nobles or make vague predictions that could mean anything. We see real fragments of possible futures. And you saw my death, Frank stated flatly. I saw blood on the royal crest, an overturned carriage, Montgomery standing over a fallen figure. Lucy met his gaze steadily. I tried to warn you in the garden. Yes, Frank frowned, and I had you dismissed. Yet here you are, disguised as a lady's maid, coming to my aid in the mountains. Why risk your life for someone who treated you so poorly? The question hung between them. Weighted with implications neither was prepared to address directly. Lucy turned away, moving to stoke the fire. It was the right thing to do, she said simply. Frank rose and paced the length of the hall, his boots echoing on the stone floor. There's something familiar about you, he said at last. Something that's been nagging at me since the garden. I feel as though I should know you. Lucy's heart hammered in her chest. She had not expected recognition so soon. If at all, the years had changed them both significantly. Perhaps you've seen me at the palace, she offered weakly. Frank shook his head. No, it's something else. Something from before. He trailed off, studying her profile against the firelight. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the shutters, extinguishing several candles and plunging half the hall into shadow. Lucy rose to relight them, using one of the remaining flames. You move like her, Frank said suddenly. Lucy froze. Like who? A girl I knew in Oak Ridge. Lucy of the Old Bridge. We called her because she lived near the stone crossing. His voice had softened, lost in memory. She could balance on the bridge's narrow edge without fear. You have the same careful way of stepping, like you're always walking a ledge, the childhood nickname, one she hadn't heard in over a decade, struck Lucy like a physical blow. She turned slowly, candle still in hand, its light illuminating her face. It is you, Frank whispered, disbelief evident in his voice. Lucy of the Old Bridge, but how, why? Yes, she admitted, setting down the candle before her shaking hands dropped it. Though I didn't think you'd remember. Princes aren't supposed to recall their commoner playmates. Frank crossed the space between them in 3 strides. Remember, how could I forget? You were my only real friend in that life. His eyes searched her face. Recognition now fully dawned. When the king's men came for me, I begged them to let me say goodbye. They refused. They told everyone to forget you had ever lived in Oakridge, Lucy said, that the prince had never been a blacksmith's son. I tried to visit once, but the palace guards laughed at a dirty child asking for the prince. I looked for you, Frank admitted. For the first year, I would sneak glimpses out windows when common folk came to the palace, hoping to see a familiar face. His expression clouded. Then the tutors and masters did their work, taught me that my past was something to be ashamed of, to be buried beneath proper speech and courtly manners. Lucy smiled sadly. They did a thorough job. When I finally secured a position as a palace maid years later, you looked right through me more than once. God forgive me, Frank murmured. I never imagined. He broke off, a new realization dawning. The fire that claimed your parents. When did it happen? Shortly after you left Oakridge, Lucy replied. We never discovered the cause. My grandmother took me in afterward. Frank's expression hardened. And now Montgomery orchestrates an ambush. And you reveal that your parents' death might not have been an accident. These can't be coincidences. The Queen Mother suggested as much, Lucy agreed. But her motivations remain unclear to me. She orchestrated my presence on this journey, yet I don't know if she intended to prevent Montgomery's plot or simply to monitor it. Elizabeth always plays multiple angles, Frank said grimly. She's been positioning her own son, my half-brother, as an alternative heir since he was born. But outright treason seems extreme, even for her. The fire crackled in a momentary lull in the storm. Frank moved to a window, peering out into the darkness. We should rest while we can. Tomorrow we must reach the main road and warn the captain of Montgomery's betrayal. And the princess? Lucy asked. Frank's shoulders tensed. If Marianne is truly in league with Montgomery, then our marriage and the alliance with Pinecrest have been shams. Parts of a larger plot I'm only beginning to understand. He turned to face Lucy. I will need proof to convince the court. My word against a princess and a duke. I'll help you, Lucy promised. But you should know that exposing them may uncover secrets neither of us is prepared for. The Queen Mother implied that my family's history is somehow entwined with all of this. Frank studied her with newfound respect. The frightened maid from the garden is gone. You've changed in just days. I've simply stopped pretending to be less than I am, Lucy replied. A necessary skill for surviving as a woman alone in this kingdom, especially one with unusual gifts. Lucy of the Old Bridge, Frank said softly, the childhood name now carrying a different weight. I remember you were always braver than me. Some things haven't changed. The intimacy of the moment stretched between them. Charged with both childhood memory and adult awareness, Lucy broke it first, moving toward a side corridor. There should be sleeping quarters through here. We should rest while we can. Lucy? Frank called as she reached the doorway. Thank you for remembering me when I forgot myself. Later, lying on a narrow monastery bed with rain still drumming against the stone walls, Lucy tried to make sense of the day's revelations. The strange pull she had always felt toward Frank now had context, their shared childhood. But this only complicated their current situation further. Her visions had shown fragments of danger. Yet in changing that future, she had created a new path equally fraught with peril. Montgomery and Marianne still lived, their plot temporarily foiled but surely not abandoned. The prince now knew her true identity, which changed everything, yet resolved nothing. And somewhere beyond these mountains, the Queen Mother waited with her own agenda, having set Lucy on this path for reasons that remained shrouded in mystery. Outside, the storm began to ease, the thunder growing more distant. Lucy closed her eyes, not expecting sleep to come easily, but exhaustion claimed her quickly, pulling her into dreams filled with burning houses, royal crests, and a boy from Oakridge who had grown into a prince who finally remembered her name. Dawn broke clear and cold over the mountains, the storm having swept away during the night. Lucy woke to sunlight streaming through narrow monastery windows and the distant sound of voices. For a moment, panic seized her. Had Montgomery's men found them? But the orderly cadence of commands suggested otherwise. She hurried to the window in the courtyard below. Royal guards in Liberty's blue and silver livery were dismounting from horses that bore signs of hard riding. The main procession had sent searchers. Exactly as Frank had predicted, Lucy quickly gathered her few belongings and made her way to the Great Hall. where she found Frank already in conversation with a captain of the guard. "Absolutely certain, Your Highness?" the captain was asking, his expression grave. "I saw it with my own eyes." "Captain Morris," Frank replied firmly. "The Duke of Montgomery orchestrated the attack, and Princess Marianne was complicit." The captain looked deeply troubled. "This is most serious, Your Highness. The diplomatic implications alone." "Where is the main procession now?" Lucy interjected, drawing both men's attention. "At the border crossing, my lady," the captain replied, clearly assuming from her clothing that she held some minor noble rank. "Lady Catherine has been most concerned for your safety." Lucy exchanged a quick glance with Frank. Her cover remained intact for now. "We must rejoin them immediately," Frank decided. "But Captain, speak of what happened only to your most trusted men, if word reaches Montgomery that we survived." "Understood, Your Highness." The captain bowed. "We've brought spare mounts. We can depart as soon as you're ready." The journey down from the monastery was tense but uneventful. Lucy rode beside Frank, while the guards formed a protective formation around them. The mountain paths, so treacherous in yesterday's storm, now offered spectacular views of the valley below, where the border between Liberty and Pinecrest was marked by a ribbon of river glinting in the morning sun. "What will you do when we reach the others?" Lucy asked quietly as they navigated a particularly steep section. Frank's expression was grim. "I cannot openly accuse Montgomery or Marianne without proof. It would be my word against theirs, and they'll claim I'm confused after the bandit attack. For now, I must play along, pretend I believe their version of events." "A dangerous game," Lucy observed. "Less dangerous than an open confrontation when we don't know who else might be involved in their conspiracy." Frank glanced at her. "I'll need your eyes, Lucy. Your gift might show us their next move." "My visions don't work on command," she cautioned, "and changing one future often creates new dangers I can't foresee. Then we'll have to rely on more mundane methods of investigation," Frank said with the ghost of a smile. "Starting with whatever we can learn at the border crossing." By midday, they crested a final ridge and saw the diplomatic encampment spread across a meadow beside the bridge that marked the official border. Colorful pavilions flew the flags of both Liberty and Pinecrest, and the bustling activity suggested no awareness of yesterday's treachery. As they approached, a cry went up from the sentries. Within moments, a commotion spread through the camp. Frank straightened in his saddle, assuming the regal bearing expected of him. "Remember," he murmured to Lucy, "trust no one but me." They rode into the camp amid a flurry of exclamations and relieved faces, all seemingly genuine. Though Lucy now questioned everything and everyone, a delegation hurried to meet them, led by a tearful Princess Marianne who played the part of the distraught wife to perfection. "My prince," she cried, rushing forward as Frank dismounted. "We feared the worst when you didn't return. The Duke said bandits had attacked your carriage." "A harrowing experience indeed," Frank interrupted smoothly, accepting her embrace with remarkable composure. "Fortunately, this lady's maid was separated from the group with me. Her knowledge of mountain paths proved invaluable." Marianne's gaze flicked to Lucy, a flash of calculation visible beneath her show of relief. "How fortunate," she said, her Pinecrest accent more pronounced than usual. "We must reward such loyalty." The Duke of Montgomery approached more cautiously, his expression a careful mask of surprise and relief. "Your Highness, this is truly miraculous. When my men reported the attack, they were certain no one could have survived." "Your men were mistaken," Frank replied coldly, "as were the bandits who thought to find easy prey." Montgomery bowed, but Lucy caught the tension in his posture. "The important thing is that you've returned safely. We were preparing to send a formal delegation to Pinecrest with news of your disappearance." "How premature," Frank observed. "I trust such messengers have been recalled." "Of course," Montgomery said smoothly. "Though perhaps we should still postpone the diplomatic meetings until you've had time to recover from your ordeal." "Nonsense," Frank countered. "We proceed as planned. I won't allow common criminals to derail our peace efforts." The subtle battle of wills continued as they moved toward the royal pavilion. Lucy found herself relegated once more to the background, though Frank ensured she was assigned as an attendant within the royal quarters, ostensibly as a reward for her help, but primarily to keep her close. The day passed in a swirl of diplomatic formalities and preparations for crossing into Pinecrest territory. Lucy moved carefully through the camp, gathering snippets of conversation and watching the interactions between Montgomery and Marianne. They were cautious, rarely speaking directly to each other, but occasionally exchanging glances that confirmed their alliance. Late in the afternoon, Lucy was arranging the princess's travel garments when Marianne entered the tent alone, an unusual occurrence, as she typically had attendants with her. "You're Lady Catherine's new maid, are you not?" Marianne asked, her voice pleasant, but her eyes sharp. Lucy cursed. "Yes, Your Highness. Strange that in all my conversations with Lady Catherine before this journey, she never mentioned acquiring new staff." Marianne circled Lucy slowly. "Fortune favors the prepared, Your Highness," Lucy replied carefully. "My grandmother taught me to always know escape routes." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." Marianne paused directly in front of Lucy. "What is your name?" "Clara, Your Highness." Lucy had prepared this lie in advance. "Clara?" Marianne repeated, clearly disbelieving. "Well, Clara, let me offer you some advice. This diplomatic mission is fraught with danger. Bandits, treacherous paths, unpredictable weather. A sensible maid might request reassignment to safer duties back at the palace." The threat was thinly veiled, but Lucy merely lowered her eyes submissively. "I serve at my lady's pleasure, Your Highness, and now at yours, since you've been so kind as to request my assistance after the ordeal in the mountains." Marianne's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Indeed, just remember that those who involve themselves in matters beyond their station often meet unfortunate ends." After Marianne left, Lucy slipped out through the back of the tent and made her way to a secluded spot where she'd arranged to meet Frank. He was already waiting, disguised in a guard's cloak to avoid notice. "Marianne suspects something," Lucy reported quietly. "She as much as threatened me to return to the palace. Montgomery has been equally suspicious," Frank replied. "He suggested I'm suffering from confusion after the attack, perhaps even suggesting to others that my accusations against bandits are the ravings of a traumatized mind. They can't risk another direct attempt so soon," Lucy reasoned. "Not with so many witnesses." "No, but once we cross into Pinecrest territory tomorrow," Frank left the implication hanging. Lucy nodded grimly. "We'll be surrounded by Marianne's countrymen, many potentially loyal to whatever cause she and Montgomery serve, which makes tonight our best opportunity to gather evidence," Frank said, lowering his voice further. "I've learned that Montgomery sends a courier to Pinecrest each evening. If we could intercept that courier—" "The risk is too great," Lucy interrupted. "If you're caught sneaking around the camp, it would confirm their claims about your mental state." Frank's jaw set stubbornly. "Then what do you suggest?" Before Lucy could answer, a sharp pain lanced through her temple, the familiar precursor to a vision. She gasped, steadying herself against a tree, as fragmented images flashed before her eyes. Documents burning in a fireplace, a family crest she didn't recognize, her own grandmother speaking urgently to a much younger queen mother. "Elizabeth, Lucy." Frank's concerned voice seemed to come from far away. "What is it? What do you see?" "Documents," she managed, the vision already fading. "Important papers being destroyed. And my grandmother, she knew the queen mother long ago." Frank supported her as the vision subsided. "Can you make sense of it?" "Not entirely," Lucy admitted. "But I believe there are documents that could expose Montgomery and Marianne, and somehow they're connected to my family's past." "The courier," Frank said thoughtfully. "Perhaps he carries such documents." Lucy shook her head. "Too risky to intercept him directly, but—" An idea formed. "Princess Marianne keeps a locked chest in her quarters. Her personal lady-in-waiting holds the key. If I could somehow—" "No," Frank cut her off. "That's too dangerous, if you're caught searching the princess's belongings." "It's our best chance," Lucy insisted. "As a maid, I can move through their quarters without raising suspicion. You cannot." Their debate was interrupted by the approach of guards changing shifts. Frank pulled his borrowed cloak tighter. "We'll discuss this later," he whispered. "Come to the west side of the royal pavilion after the midnight bell. The guards there are loyal to me, not Montgomery." As Lucy made her way back to her duties, the fragments of her vision continued to trouble her. What connection could her grandmother possibly have to the Queen Mother? And what documents were so dangerous they needed to be destroyed? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly assembling, but the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. Much like her visions themselves, one thing seemed increasingly clear. The conspiracy against Frank was only part of a much larger plot, with roots stretching far into the past, somehow entangled with her own family history. And tonight, one way or another, she would begin uncovering those buried truths. The midnight bell had just finished its final toll when Lucy slipped through the shadows toward the west side of the royal pavilion. The camp had quieted, with only the occasional patrol of guards breaking the stillness. She pulled her borrowed cloak tighter against the mountain chill. As promised, Frank waited in the shadow of a supply wagon, accompanied by a single guard whose weathered face remained impassive as Lucy approached. "This is Captain Thorne," Frank introduced in a whisper. "One of the few men I trust completely. He served my father before me and has no love for Montgomery." The captain nodded tersely. "The lady's maid with unusual talents. His Highness has explained your situation." Lucy felt a flicker of unease that Frank had shared her secret, but pushed it aside. "Have you decided on our course of action?" "Yes," Frank replied, "but it's changed somewhat. We've had an unexpected development." He gestured for her to follow as they moved deeper into the shadows. Captain Thorne intercepted a message meant for Montgomery, a warning from someone within the Pinecrest court. "What kind of warning?" Lucy asked. "The kind that suggests not everyone in Pinecrest supports whatever Montgomery and Marianne are planning," Frank explained. "It seems the princess's claim to the Pinecrest royal line may be as fraudulent as her affection for me." Lucy absorbed this with growing understanding. "So Montgomery's scheme is even larger than we thought. He's not just trying to eliminate you, he's positioning Marianne to control both kingdoms." "Precisely," Frank nodded grimly. "But this message suggests there's a faction in Pinecrest that opposes her. Potential allies, if we can identify them. Tomorrow we cross the border," Lucy reminded him. "Once in Pinecrest territory, Montgomery's position only strengthens, which is why we must act tonight." Frank turned to Captain Thorne. "Show her." The captain produced a small key from inside his uniform. "This opens the princess's document chest. One of her ladies is sympathetic to the prince's cause." After witnessing her mistress's reaction to news of his death yesterday, Lucy took the key, understanding immediately. "You want me to search the chest while the princess sleeps?" "Not alone," Frank clarified. "Captain Thorne will create a diversion on the east side of the camp. I'll accompany you disguised as a guard." Lucy raised an eyebrow. "Quite a risk for a prince. Less risky than blindly walking into Pinecrest as a puppet in Montgomery's scheme," Frank countered. "Besides, I've had some experience sneaking around in my youth." A hint of the Oak Ridge boy flickered in his smile. The plan was simple in concept but dangerous in execution. They would enter the princess's quarters under the pretense of a security check, while Captain Thorne staged a disturbance to draw attention away from their activities. Lucy would access the document chest while Frank stood guard. "If we're discovered," Frank warned as they approached the princess's tent, "I'll claim I ordered the search due to concerns about spies. You'll be protected." Lucy appreciated the sentiment, though she doubted royal protection would extend far if Montgomery uncovered their true purpose. Captain Thorne's diversion came right on schedule, shouts and commotion erupting from the eastern perimeter of the camp. As guards rushed to investigate, Frank and Lucy slipped into Marianne's private quarters, a luxurious tent divided into sleeping and reception areas by heavy silk partitions. The princess was absent, likely summoned by the commotion, or perhaps meeting secretly with Montgomery. Either way, it gave them precious minutes to search. The document chest sat at the foot of Marianne's traveling bed, an ornate thing of polished wood with the Pinecrest royal crest inlaid in pearl. Lucy's hands trembled slightly as she fitted the key to the lock. "Hurry," Frank whispered, keeping watch by the tent entrance. The chest opened with a soft click. Inside, neatly arranged packets of letters tied with silk ribbon sat alongside official-looking documents bearing wax seals. Lucy quickly rifled through them, her eyes scanning for anything significant. "These are all diplomatic correspondence," she murmured, frustrated. "Nothing incriminating." "Check for false compartments," Frank suggested. "Montgomery is too careful to leave evidence in plain sight." Lucy ran her fingers along the chest's interior, pressing experimentally until she felt a section of the bottom shift. "Here," she whispered triumphantly. The false bottom revealed a hidden cache of documents. Lucy extracted them carefully, immediately recognizing the importance of the top parchment, a birth record with multiple seals. "Frank," she called softly, "you need to see this." He joined her, keeping one eye on the tent entrance as he examined the document. "This is Marianne's birth record," he said, brow furrowing. "But the names—" "Her father is listed as Montgomery," Lucy confirmed. "She's his daughter, not a Pinecrest royal. A complete fabrication," Frank breathed. "Her claim to the Pinecrest throne is entirely false." Lucy shuffled through the remaining papers, stopping abruptly when a familiar crest caught her eye. The same one from her vision. "This seal, I've seen it before." The document was old. The ink faded, but the content unmistakable. A record of lineage for the Duchy of Highcliffe, including a marriage certificate and birth records spanning 3 generations. Lucy's hands began to shake. "This is my family," she whispered in disbelief. "My grandmother's name is here, and my mother's." She traced the names with trembling fingers, pieces clicking into place. "We're descendants of the Duchess of Highcliffe." Frank's expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension. The Highcliffe line was thought to have ended during my grandfather's reign. Their lands were absorbed by the crown after a supposed treason. "Not treason," Lucy said, anger building as she continued reading. "Usurpation. Your grandfather seized their lands and erased their claim when the last duke died without a male heir. But the female line continued. Through my grandmother, then my mother, and now you," Frank finished, his voice hushed. "Lucy, do you understand what this means? You have a legitimate claim to the Highcliffe lands and title, which explains why Montgomery had these documents," Lucy realized, "and possibly why my parents died in that fire. Any surviving Highcliffe heir would threaten his plans, especially if—" She stopped, a horrible thought forming. "If what?" Frank prompted. "If the Highcliffe claim isn't just to their own lands, but has some connection to the royal succession itself," Lucy said slowly. "My grandmother once told me our family was connected to the old royal line, before your grandfather's dynasty. I thought it was just an old woman's fancy, but—" Voices outside the tent interrupted her theory. Frank quickly helped Lucy return all but the most crucial documents to the chest, keeping only Marianne's true birth record and the Highcliffe lineage papers. "We have to go," he urged, securing the false bottom and closing the chest. They had barely locked it when the tent flap opened, and Princess Marianne entered. Accompanied by her gray-haired lady-in-waiting, she stopped abruptly at the sight of them. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her face composed but eyes flashing dangerously. Frank straightened, every inch the commanding prince. "Security inspection, Your Highness, after yesterday's attack. I've ordered thorough checks of all quarters." Marianne's gaze flicked between them, lingering suspiciously on Lucy. "In the middle of the night, without my knowledge or consent. Security concerns supersede protocol," Frank replied smoothly. "I apologize for the disruption." The princess's lady-in-waiting moved subtly toward the document chest, her eyes narrowing as she noted the slightly disturbed position. "We've completed our inspection," Frank continued, moving toward the exit. "Everything appears to be in order." "Indeed," Marianne's tone dripped with skepticism. "How thorough of you, husband, and how unexpected that you would conduct such inspections personally, especially after your ordeal." The tension in the tent was palpable, a silent battle of wills as Marianne clearly weighed the risk of openly challenging them versus playing along with Frank's explanation. Finally, she offered a cold smile. "Your dedication to our safety is commendable, though in the future, perhaps daylight hours would be more appropriate for such inspections." "Noted," Frank replied with equal frost. "Come, guard, let us continue our rounds." Outside, they moved swiftly through the shadows toward the rendezvous point, where Captain Thorne waited. Lucy could feel her heart pounding, the stolen documents like burning coals against her skin where she'd hidden them. "She knows," Lucy whispered once they were safely away. "The lady-in-waiting will check the chest immediately. Then we've bought ourselves hours at most before Montgomery learns of our discovery," Frank agreed grimly. "We need to secure these documents and prepare for their response." Captain Thorne met them behind the supply wagons, his expression grave. The diversion worked, but Montgomery was asking questions. He's suspicious. Our position grows more precarious by the hour, Frank acknowledged. Captain, we need to prepare for immediate departure back to Liberty if necessary. The diplomatic implications, Thorne began, are insignificant compared to the conspiracy we've uncovered. Frank cut him off. Liberty is being manipulated into an alliance with false royalty, orchestrated by my treasonous uncle. Lucy watched the interaction, clutching the documents that had upended her understanding of her own past. The revelation of her noble lineage felt almost inconsequential compared to the immediate danger they faced. What now? She asked quietly. Frank turned to her, his expression softening momentarily. Now we protect these documents with our lives. They're not just evidence of Marianne's deception. They're proof of your birthright. The weight of that birthright settled uncomfortably on Lucy's shoulders. All her life, she'd been defined by her visions and her status as an orphaned commoner. The possibility that she might be something else entirely, an heir to a noble house with claims that threatened the very foundations of the kingdom, was almost too much to comprehend. Tomorrow we cross into Pinecrest, she said, focusing on the immediate threat, into territory where Montgomery will have even more allies, and perhaps where we might find allies of our own, Frank reminded her, referencing the mysterious message from Pinecrest opponents of Marianne. As they parted ways for what remained of the night, Lucy felt the fragile web of alliances shifting around them, Montgomery and Marianne on one side, Frank and herself on another, with the Queen Mother Elizabeth playing some unfathomable game of her own, and somewhere in Pinecrest waited unknown factors, those who supported Marianne's false claim and those who opposed it. The documents hidden beneath her mattress offered answers to questions about her past, but raised new questions about her future, and the future of two kingdoms standing on the precipice of change. The border crossing into Pinecrest proceeded with elaborate ceremony. The following morning, heralds announced the royal party's arrival as they crossed the stone bridge spanning the river that separated the two kingdoms. Pinecrest guards in emerald and gold livery lined the route, their polished armor gleaming in the sunlight. Lucy, once again relegated to her role as lady's maid, watched the proceedings from the periphery. The stolen documents remained safely hidden, sewn into the lining of her modest traveling cloak by Captain Thorne's trusted seamstress during the pre-dawn hours. Quite the spectacle, murmured Georgina beside her. Though the princess seems tense for someone returning to her homeland. Lucy studied Marianne, who indeed sat stiffly in the royal carriage beside Frank. The princess's face betrayed nothing, but her gloved hands twisted restlessly in her lap. Montgomery rode nearby, his expression carefully neutral as he surveyed the Pinecrest welcoming committee. Politics makes everyone tense, Lucy replied noncommittally. After crossing the border, the procession wound through increasingly lush countryside toward the summer palace of Pinecrest, a sprawling estate nestled in a verdant valley where the kingdom's nobility retreated during the hottest months. By midday, the palace came into view, a marvel of white stone and soaring glass that caught the sunlight like a massive jewel. Lucy had managed only a brief exchange with Frank that morning, confirming that their plans remained unchanged: maintain appearances, watch for potential allies among the Pinecrest nobility, and prepare for Montgomery's inevitable countermove. Once he discovered the theft, the summer palace's grounds bustled with activity, as servants and nobles prepared for the evening's formal welcome banquet. Lucy used her duties as cover to observe the interactions between Montgomery and various Pinecrest officials. Most showed him appropriate respect for a visiting dignitary, but a few, particularly an austere older man introduced as Lord Chancellor Blackwood, displayed subtle signs of familiarity that suggested deeper connections. "The Chancellor seems quite comfortable with our Duke," Lucy commented casually to another servant as they prepared guest chambers. "They've been thick as thieves for years," the Pinecrest maid replied, without looking up from her work. "Ever since the old king's illness began." Lucy filed this information away carefully. Blackwood's position would give him significant influence over succession matters, a useful ally for someone plotting to install a puppet ruler. By late afternoon, Lucy had mapped the palace's main corridors and identified potential escape routes, a habit ingrained by her grandmother that now seemed increasingly prudent. She was returning from the laundry rooms when a hand shot out from an alcove, pulling her into a shadowed recess. She nearly cried out before recognizing Frank, dressed in the simpler attire he wore when avoiding formal duties. Montgomery knows, he whispered urgently. The princess's chest was thoroughly searched this morning. They're hiding it well, but they're frantic. Have they connected the theft to us? Lucy asked. Not explicitly, but Montgomery has requested a private audience with me before the banquet. He claims it's about trade agreements, but it's a trap, Lucy finished. You can't go alone. Frank's jaw tightened. I have little choice without arousing further suspicion, but I've arranged precautions. He pressed a small dagger into her hands. Keep this with you, and if I don't appear at the banquet on time, don't, Lucy interrupted, her heart racing. Don't even suggest it. We must be realistic, Frank insisted. If something happens to me, get those documents to Captain Thorne. He has instructions to escort you back to Liberty and directly to the king. Lucy wanted to argue, but recognized the logic of his planning. At least tell me where this meeting will take place. If my visions come, Montgomery's quarters in the East Wing, an hour before the banquet. Frank squeezed her hand briefly. Be careful, Lucy. We're in the heart of their territory now. After he left, Lucy continued her duties with heightened awareness. She was arranging Princess Marianne's gown for the evening when a vision struck. Not gradually as usual, but with the sudden force of lightning. Blood on marble floors. Montgomery standing over Frank's motionless body. Marianne watching from the doorway, a goblet of wine in her hand, and something new. A flash of green powder being stirred into a drink. Lucy gasped, steadying herself against a wall as the vision receded. Poison. They meant to poison Frank during their private meeting. There was no time to find Captain Thorne. The hour of the meeting was approaching, and Lucy needed to act immediately. She hurried to her assigned quarters, retrieving the dagger Frank had given her and concealing it in her skirts. The East Wing was quieter than the rest of the palace. With most staff busy preparing for the banquet, Lucy navigated the corridors with purpose, projecting the confidence of someone exactly where she belonged. When she rounded the final corner toward Montgomery's quarters, she slowed, hearing voices from a partially open door. Cannot afford mistakes at this stage, Montgomery was saying, his voice tight with controlled anger. The documents must be recovered. My servants are searching every inch of the prince's belongings, Marianne replied. If he has them, he will never leave Pinecrest with them, Montgomery cut in. Or perhaps at all. Lucy pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering. Through the crack in the door, she could see Montgomery measuring green powder from a small vial into a wine decanter. Such measures weren't supposed to be necessary here, Marianne said, watching the process with cold detachment. The mountains were the perfect location. Plans adapt, Montgomery replied shortly. The prince proves more resourceful than anticipated, or perhaps better advised. He swirled the wine gently. This, at least, will appear as a tragic illness, diplomatic regrets, a state funeral, and you, a grieving widow, perfectly positioned to strengthen ties between our kingdoms through a regency. Lucy had heard enough. Frank would arrive any minute, walking directly into their trap. She needed a diversion, something to prevent the meeting without revealing her knowledge. Inspiration struck as she spotted a Pinecrest guard approaching on his rounds. Lucy stepped into his path, her expression frantic. Sir, please, you must help. There's a fire in the kitchens. They're calling for all available hands. The guard hesitated only briefly before hurrying toward the main wing. As soon as he disappeared, Lucy moved to a decorative tapestry hanging nearby, and, after a quick glance to ensure she was unobserved, set its corner alight with a candle from a wall sconce. The thick fabric caught slowly at first. Then, with increasing vigor, Lucy backed away, then hurried toward the corridor Frank would likely use. She found him approaching with two of his own guards. Your Highness, she called, dropping into a quick curtsy. There's a fire in the East Wing. The Duke's quarters are being evacuated. Frank's eyes narrowed slightly, reading the urgency in her expression. How unfortunate. We should assist with the evacuation. By the time they reached Montgomery's corridor, servants were already responding to the smoke, and the Duke himself had emerged from his quarters, visibly furious at the disruption. His eyes narrowed dangerously when he spotted Frank. Your Highness, Montgomery said, mastering his expression. It seems our meeting must be postponed due to this unfortunate accident. Indeed, Frank replied smoothly. Perhaps a blessing in disguise. It wouldn't do to be late for tonight's banquet. The Pinecrest court awaits us both. Montgomery's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. Though perhaps you might join me for a quick drink elsewhere to discuss the trade matters I mentioned. I've had a special vintage prepared. Most generous, Frank said. But duty calls? We shall speak at the banquet. As Frank turned away, Lucy caught Montgomery's gaze shifting to her, a flash of suspicion crossing his features before he schooled them back to neutrality. Your servant is quite attentive, he observed to Frank. I don't recall seeing her among your usual staff in Liberty. Lady Catherine's maid, Frank replied casually, after her assistance during the bandit attack. I've found her services valuable. Montgomery's smile didn't reach his eyes. Indeed. Fortunate that she was nearby to raise the alarm about this fire as well. The implication hung in the air, but Frank merely nodded politely and continued down the corridor. Lucy followed at a respectful distance, painfully aware of Montgomery's gaze tracking her every move. Once safely away, Frank pulled her into an empty chamber, his guards securing the door. A fire, he asked, his voice low, rather dramatic. I had a vision, Lucy explained quickly. They planned to poison your wine. I saw you. I saw. She couldn't bring herself to describe his lifeless body on the marble floor. Understanding dawned in Frank's eyes. You saved my life again. Montgomery suspects me now, Lucy warned. He made the connection to the fire too quickly. Then we must accelerate our plans, Frank decided. The banquet tonight will gather all the key Pinecrest nobles if we can identify potential allies. It's too dangerous, Lucy protested. They'll be watching both of us now, which is precisely why we must act while they think we're still gathering evidence, Frank countered. They don't know we have the documents. That gives us an advantage, however temporary, Lucy wanted to argue, but recognized the determination in his expression. The boy from Oak Ridge who had stood up to bullies twice his size still lived within the prince. What's our move then? She asked. At the banquet, watch for Lord Eastleigh, an older nobleman with a silver beard, according to Captain Thorne's intelligence. He leads the faction opposing Marianne's claim. If we can get the documents to him, the palace bells chimed, signaling the hour to prepare for the evening's festivities. Frank touched Lucy's arm briefly. Be careful tonight, he said softly. Montgomery won't underestimate you again. As Lucy hurried back to her duties, the weight of the hidden documents seemed heavier than ever. Tonight, at the banquet, all the conspiracy's threads would converge. Montgomery and Marianne's plot, Frank's countermove, and Lucy's own mysterious connection to a noble past. She was only beginning to understand. The vision of blood on marble floors continued to haunt her. She had prevented one version of that future, but experience had taught her that some fates were persistent, finding new paths when old ones were blocked. Tonight, in the summer palace of Pinecrest, a new future would be written, but whose hand would guide the pen remained to be seen. The summer palace's grand hall blazed with hundreds of candles, their light reflecting off gilded surfaces and crystal chandeliers. Nobility from Pinecrest and Liberty mingled beneath vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of historic alliances between the two kingdoms. Alliances that, Lucy knew, had often been as false as the one currently masquerading as peace. From her position along the wall with other servants, Lucy watched the elaborate dance of politics unfold. Frank sat at the high table beside Princess Marianne, playing his role perfectly. Attentive husband, diplomatic envoy, unsuspecting target. Montgomery had been placed in a position of honor nearby, engaging easily with Pinecrest officials as if he weren't plotting treason against two royal houses simultaneously. Lucy scanned the assembled nobility for Lord Eastleigh, finally spotting the silver-bearded noble at a side table, deep in conversation with several other older lords. His position, deliberately distanced from the high table, spoke volumes about his relationship with the current Pinecrest power structure. The servant girl who sees too much, a soft voice murmured beside her. Lucy turned to find the princess's gray-haired lady-in-waiting, Lady Powell, studying her with shrewd eyes. I don't know what you mean, my lady, Lucy replied carefully. I think you do. Lady Powell's smile was thin, first at the border camp, then conveniently raising the alarm about a fire. One might think you have a special interest in the prince's well-being. Lucy maintained her composure, though her pulse quickened. I serve at my lady's pleasure. And which lady might that be? I wonder. Not Lady Catherine, certainly. Lady Powell's gaze was penetrating. The Queen Mother, perhaps Elizabeth, always did have a fondness for unusual talents. Before Lucy could formulate a response, a commotion at the high table drew everyone's attention. Montgomery had risen to offer a toast, his commanding presence instantly silencing the hall. "Distinguished guests," he projected, goblet raised. "We gather to celebrate not merely a diplomatic mission, but the embodiment of unity between our kingdoms. Prince Frank and his bride, our beloved Princess Mary Ann." Polite applause rippled through the hall. Frank smiled diplomatically, though Lucy could see the tension in his shoulders. "Few know," Montgomery continued, "that I have had the privilege of watching this alliance develop from its earliest stages. Indeed, I consider myself something of an architect of this peace." The double meaning wasn't lost on Lucy, nor on Frank, whose knuckles whitened around his goblet. And yet, Montgomery's tone shifted subtly. Peace is fragile. It requires honesty, trust, and legitimate authority. He turned toward Lord Eastley's table. "Wouldn't you agree, my lord?" Eastley's expression remained impassive. "Legitimacy is indeed the foundation of lasting peace, your grace." "Precisely," Montgomery smiled thinly, "which is why I feel compelled to address certain rumors that have recently reached my attention." Lucy tensed. This was an unexpected move. Rumors suggesting that certain documents have gone missing, documents that might question the very foundations of our alliance. Montgomery's gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Lucy. "I assure everyone present that such rumors are baseless. The lineage of both our royal houses stands unimpeachable." Frank rose smoothly, joining the conversation with practiced ease. "An unusual toast, Duke Montgomery. I wasn't aware that anyone questioned our alliance's foundations." "Merely addressing whispers, your highness," Montgomery replied. "As you've recently discovered, there are those who would seek to undermine peace between our kingdoms." "Indeed," Frank agreed. "Bandits in the mountains, fires in the palace. One might almost suspect a conspiracy." The tension in the hall was palpable now, the diplomatic niceties barely masking the dangerous currents flowing beneath. Lucy could see Lord Eastley watching the exchange with intense interest. Clearly recognizing the subtext, Lady Powell touched Lucy's arm. "A wise servant knows when to retreat from a battlefield," she murmured. "This hall will soon become one, I fear." As if confirming her words, Montgomery's expression hardened. "Perhaps, your highness, we should speak more directly about these concerns in private." "I believe transparency serves us better," Frank countered. "If there are questions about legitimacy, let them be addressed openly." Mary Ann rose, her face a careful mask of concern. "My husband has been under considerable strain since the bandit attack. Perhaps he should rest." "I assure you, I'm in perfect health," Frank cut in. "Unlike the wine in your quarters, Montgomery, which I understand suffered some contamination this afternoon." The direct accusation sent murmurs rippling through the assembly. Montgomery's face darkened momentarily before he regained control. "A serious allegation, your highness, almost as serious as theft from royal quarters." Lucy saw guards shifting positions around the perimeter of the hall, some wearing Pinecrest colors, others Montgomery's green livery. The situation was escalating toward confrontation faster than anticipated. Lady Powell had vanished from Lucy's side. Scanning the room, Lucy spotted her whispering urgently to Princess Mary Ann, whose expression shifted from controlled poise to something more complex. Worry, perhaps, or even fear. Frank had maneuvered away from the high table, casually but deliberately moving toward Lord Eastley's position. Montgomery tracked his movement, signaling subtly to his men. Lucy needed to act. The documents hidden in her cloak could expose the entire conspiracy, but getting them to Lord Eastley now, with all eyes on Frank, seemed impossible. A sudden inspiration struck. Lucy slipped toward a servant's entrance, circling through back corridors to approach Lord Eastley's table from behind. As she re-entered the hall, she noticed with alarm that Montgomery had moved to intercept Frank, their confrontation now taking place in the center of the room. "I suggest we end this charade, your highness," Montgomery was saying, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hall. "You have something that belongs to the princess." "Curious," Frank replied. "I was under the impression they belonged to history, and to justice." As they spoke, Lucy positioned herself behind Lord Eastley, carrying a pitcher of wine as if serving. When she leaned forward to fill his goblet, she whispered, "The prince has proof of false lineage. Montgomery plots against both thrones. Eastleigh gave no sign of having heard, but his hand moved slightly, creating a space beside him into which Lucy deftly slipped a folded corner of the Highcliffe lineage document. Montgomery's voice rose. "Captain, secure the prince. He is suffering from delusions that present a diplomatic risk." Guards in green moved forward, but Frank's own men stepped between them. Throughout the hall, nobles rose from their seats, sides being chosen without words as the confrontation teetered on the edge of violence. "Stop this!" Princess Marianne's voice cut through the tension. She stood, pale but composed, beside Lady Powell. "There has been enough deception." All eyes turned to her. Montgomery's expression flashed from confidence to uncertainty. "Your Highness, this isn't the time." "It is precisely the time," Marianne countered, her accent stronger with emotion. "Before blood is shed over lies I can no longer support." Lucy watched in astonishment as the princess descended from the high table to stand between Frank and Montgomery. "I am not the legitimate heir to Pinecrest," she announced clearly. "My claim was manufactured by Duke Montgomery, who is my father, not my advisor." Gasps and exclamations erupted throughout the hall. Lord Eastleigh rose, the document Lucy had passed him now in his hand. "We have suspected as much for some time," Eastleigh declared. "The late king's true heir was spirited away as an infant when her parents were killed in a suspicious fire, a tragedy orchestrated by Montgomery to install his own daughter in her place." Montgomery's composure finally cracked. "Lies, slander against a noble house. The evidence suggests otherwise," Frank stated, gesturing toward the document Eastleigh held. "Documents bearing your own seal, Montgomery, detailing the plot." Chaos erupted as Montgomery shouted orders to his men. Swords were drawn. Nobles scrambled for safety, and the careful choreography of the diplomatic banquet dissolved into frantic movement. Lucy pushed through the crowd toward Frank, but found her path blocked by Montgomery himself, his face contorted with rage as he backed away from advancing Pinecrest guards loyal to Eastleigh. "You!" he snarled, recognizing her. The maid with too many talents, Elizabeth's little spy. Before Lucy could react, he seized her, a dagger appearing at her throat. The hall fell silent as Montgomery backed toward an exit, using Lucy as a shield. "Stand back," he commanded, "or the girl dies." Frank stepped forward, his expression dangerous. "Release her, Montgomery, it's over." "Nothing is over while I live," Montgomery retorted, "and I still have one card to play." He pressed the blade against Lucy's skin. "Did you know, nephew, who you've been protecting? This girl is the last Highcliffe heir, the family your grandfather destroyed to secure his throne. Her claim predates your entire line." Lucy felt the pressure of the blade, but more shocking was the public declaration of her heritage and its implications. "I know exactly who she is," Frank replied steadily, "which is why I will not allow you to harm her. The crimes of the past don't justify new ones." Montgomery's laugh was bitter. Noble sentiments from a bastard prince defending a servant girl with royal blood. How the mighty have fallen. "It is you who have fallen, father," Marianne said, stepping forward despite Lady Powell's attempt to hold her back. "I will not watch you add more blood to what stains your hands already." "You ungrateful child," Montgomery hissed. "Everything I've done, every manipulation, every death, was to secure your future. A future built on corpses and lies," Marianne replied, her voice breaking. "I cannot stand it anymore." What happened next unfolded with terrible swiftness. Marianne lunged forward as if to pull Lucy from her father's grasp. Montgomery, startled, swung his dagger toward this new threat. Lucy twisted, trying to break free and warn Marianne. The blade that had been at Lucy's throat plunged into Marianne's chest instead. For one frozen moment, father and daughter stared at each other in shock. Then Marianne collapsed, blood blooming across her gown like a crimson flower. "No!" Montgomery's cry was primal as he released Lucy to catch his falling daughter. Frank rushed forward, pulling Lucy to safety as guards surrounded Montgomery, who cradled Marianne, his face transformed by grief and disbelief. "Why?" he whispered to his daughter. "Why would you do this?" Marianne's voice was faint, but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "Because someone had to end it. Too many have died for your ambition." Her gaze shifted to Lucy. "Including her parents. I couldn't bear another death." Lucy knelt beside the dying princess, taking her hand. You knew about me. Not until recently, Marianne managed, blood staining her lips. When Father realized who you were. Too many coincidences, the visions, like your grandmother's. She coughed, her strength visibly fading. Frank crouched on her other side. Your Highness, he said gently. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten. Marianne smiled faintly. Not your Highness. Never was. Just a pawn who finally chose her own move. Her eyes closed. Make it right. Both of you. She spoke no more, her hand growing limp in Lucy's grasp as the life ebbed from her body. Montgomery, restrained by guards but allowed to remain beside his daughter, let out a sound of such raw anguish that even those who knew his crimes felt a moment of pity. As Marianne was carried away and Montgomery taken into custody, Frank helped Lucy to her feet. The hall was in disarray. The diplomatic banquet transformed into a scene of historical reckoning as Lord Eastleigh and his allies secured the palace. She saved me, Lucy said numbly. Why would she do that? Perhaps she saw a chance for redemption, Frank replied softly. A life of deception must weigh heavily on the soul. Around them, the future of two kingdoms was being reshaped by revelations and sacrifice. But in that moment, amid the chaos and tragedy, Lucy and Frank stood together, the orphaned heir and the bastard prince, their shared past connecting them to a future neither could have foreseen. 3 months after the events at the Summer Palace, Liberty's Grand Cathedral was transformed for a coronation unlike any in the kingdom's history. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across assembled nobles, foreign dignitaries, and, most unusually, common citizens who had been invited to witness the historic occasion. Lucy stood before a mirror in a preparation chamber, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her. Gone was the simple servant's dress, replaced by an elegant gown of deep blue embroidered with silver threads that formed the restored crest of House Highcliffe. Her grandmother, Alara, sat nearby, her weathered hands folded in her lap, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Your mother would be so proud, Alara said softly. As would your father. I wish they could have seen this day, Lucy replied, touching the silver pendant at her throat, an heirloom recovered from Montgomery's collection of stolen treasures. The door opened, admitting Queen Mother Elizabeth, regal as ever in black and silver since their return to Liberty. Elizabeth's position had become precarious. Her involvement with Montgomery's schemes remained ambiguous, enough to avoid charges of treason, but sufficient to warrant careful observation. It's time, Elizabeth announced, her gaze assessing Lucy critically. The king is growing impatient. King Gerald, Frank's father, had deteriorated rapidly after learning of Montgomery's betrayal. The knowledge that his own half-brother had plotted against the crown, combined with the revelations about the Highcliffe usurpation during his father's reign, had shaken him profoundly. Now he rarely left his chambers, having named Frank as regent until today's formal transition of power. And Montgomery? Lucy asked. It was a question she'd posed frequently in recent months. Elizabeth's expression tightened. Still awaiting execution, Frank has delayed the sentence 3 times now, weighing justice against mercy. Montgomery's fate had become a symbolic decision, one that would set the tone for the new monarchy's approach to past wrongs and future governance. The Duke's actions cost many lives, Alara spoke up, her voice stronger than her frail appearance suggested, including my daughter and son-in-law. Justice has waited long enough. The 3 women, each representing different facets of Liberty's complex history, made their way through the cathedral's back corridors. Lucy could hear the murmur of the assembled crowd growing louder as they approached. Remember, Elizabeth cautioned as they neared the main chamber, many still question your claim. Despite the evidence, your every move will be scrutinized. I'm well aware of the skepticism, Lucy replied. She had faced it daily since returning to Liberty as Lady Lucy of Highcliffe, rather than the maid Lucy Martinez. They paused at the entrance to the cathedral's main hall. Beyond, Lucy could see Frank standing before the throne, resplendent in ceremonial attire. Captain Thorne and a contingent of loyal guards flanked him, their faces solemn with the gravity of the occasion. This is where we part ways, Elizabeth said. I'll take my place with the court. You'll enter when the trumpets sound. After the Queen Mother departed, Alara squeezed Lucy's hand. Whatever happens in there, remember who you are. Not just a title or a lineage, but the girl who saw truth when others saw only what they wished to believe. "I couldn't have survived any of this without you," Lucy said, embracing her grandmother. "Your stories, your guidance, your gift, our gift," Alara corrected gently. "Use it wisely in the years to come." The trumpets sounded, their clear notes silencing the assembly. Lucy took a deep breath and stepped forward alone into the cathedral's vast nave. Hundreds of faces turned to watch her progress down the central aisle. Among them, Lucy recognized many who had featured in the events of recent months. Lord Eastley, now serving as Pinecrest's interim regent, Lady Powell, who had revealed her longtime role as a secret opponent of Montgomery's schemes, even Georgina, the gossipy lady's maid who had unwittingly provided crucial information during their journey. Frank watched Lucy's approach, with an expression that combined official dignity with something more personal, a connection that had deepened through shared danger and the rediscovery of their childhood bond. The Archbishop of Liberty stepped forward, as Lucy reached the dais, his voice resonating through the cathedral. "We gather today for a coronation, but also for a reconciliation, of past and present, of wrongs and rights, of divided houses united by wisdom and courage." Frank stepped forward, unrolling an ancient parchment bearing seals and signatures. "Before the crown passes to a new generation, let truth be acknowledged," he declared. "This document confirms the rightful claim of Lady Lucy of Highcliffe to lands and titles unjustly seized by the crown during the reign of King William." Murmurs rippled through the assembly as Frank continued. "As my first act as king, I restore these rights and recognize the Lady of Highcliffe as a rightful noble of liberty, with all attendant privileges and responsibilities." The formal acknowledgement brought tears to Lucy's eyes, not for the restoration of wealth or status, but for the validation of her family's history and the memory of her parents who had died protecting it. "I am humbled by this justice," she responded, her voice clear and steady, "and I pledge my loyalty to a crown that values truth above convenience and right above might." What followed was the traditional coronation ceremony, with Frank kneeling to receive the crown of liberty from the Archbishop. As he rose, now officially King Frank the Win, the assembly broke into cheers and applause. But then came the moment that would truly distinguish this coronation from all that had preceded it. Frank turned to Lucy, taking her hand to guide her forward. "Citizens of liberty," he addressed the crowd, "I stand before you not merely as your king by right of birth, but as a man who has learned that true nobility lies in character rather than bloodline. The crown I wear represents not just my authority, but my responsibility to all people of this kingdom, noble and common alike." He gestured toward Lucy. "Lady Highcliffe saved my life multiple times during our recent journey, not because of duty to crown or country, but from personal courage and conviction. Her actions represent the best qualities we should seek in those who govern." Lucy felt the weight of every gaze upon her as Frank continued. "For too long, liberty has been ruled by a single perspective. Today, that changes." He turned to face her directly. "Lady Lucy of Highcliffe, I ask you not only to join your house to mine in marriage, but to rule beside me as an equal, to bring your wisdom, your gift of foresight, and your understanding of all our citizens to the governance of this kingdom." Though they had discussed this moment privately, the public declaration still left Lucy momentarily speechless. This wasn't merely a proposal of marriage, but a fundamental reshaping of Liberty's power structure, one that would elevate her not as a consort, but as a co-ruler. She found her voice at last. "I accept, Your Majesty, not only your offer of marriage, but the shared burden of leadership. Together, we will build a kingdom where birth determines neither one's worth nor one's potential." Frank smiled, the formal mask of kingship briefly giving way to genuine emotion. "Then let it be so declared." The Archbishop stepped forward once more, clearly navigating unexpected ceremonial territory. "By the authority vested in me, I recognize this union of houses and of hearts. May the reign of King Frank and Queen Lucy bring prosperity and justice to liberty." As the cathedral erupted in a chorus of "Long live the King, long live the Queen," Lucy's gaze found her grandmother in the front row, tears streaming down Alara's face. Beside her sat a group that would have been unthinkable at any previous coronation. 7 children from diverse backgrounds, their expressions ranging from awe to excitement. These children, orphans of noble and common birth alike, represented Frank and Lucy's most radical innovation. In recognition of Lucy's inability to bear children due to the poison she had intercepted to save Frank, they had adopted these 7 as their heirs, establishing a new tradition where the crown would pass not solely by blood, but by merit and character. The youngest, a boy named Michael from Oak Ridge, who reminded Lucy painfully of Frank in his childhood, caught her eye and grinned widely. Later, as they processed from the cathedral to greet the crowds gathered outside, Frank leaned close to Lucy. "Montgomery has requested to see you before his execution tomorrow." Lucy tensed. "Why would he ask for me specifically?" "He claims to have information about your parents, details not covered in the documents we recovered." Frank's expression was troubled. "You don't have to see him." Lucy considered this as they paused at the cathedral doors, preparing to step out to face their subjects for the first time as king and queen. "I'll hear what he has to say," she decided. "The past has shaped us, but it doesn't define our future." She looked up at Frank, the boy from Oak Ridge who had become a king and found strength in his steady gaze. "Our story is only beginning." Together, they stepped into the sunlight, where thousands cheered the dawn of a new era, one built not on the divine right of kings, but on the radical notion that leadership came in many forms, and that true nobility stemmed from actions rather than ancestry. As Lucy raised her hand to greet her people, a brief vision flashed before her eyes. Not of danger this time, but of Michael, the young boy from Oak Ridge, years in the future, his eyes shining with the same gift she possessed as he guided liberty through challenges yet unimagined. Some gifts, it seemed, transcended blood. Some legacies were passed not through lineage but through love, and some kingdoms were built not on the foundations of the past, but on the promise of a more just future.